Absolutely.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today in this installment of the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta's webcast series. Today, we're going to be talking about lobbying and advocacy for tax-exempt organizations, and specifically 501c3s. And we were thrilled to have with us today Doug Chalmers to speak to us about this topic. But before Doug speaks about the substance for today's presentation, I'd like to take this opportunity to tell our audience a little bit about PBPA and our work. PBPA's mission is to provide free legal services to community-based nonprofits in the metro Atlanta area. And the way we're able to do this is through our network of amazing volunteers, such as Doug. They're with law firms and organizations or corporations throughout Atlanta and honestly throughout the US. And they advise our clients on business law matters. We also have resources available for non-clients. Our clients, though, are 501c3s, primarily based out of Metro Atlanta, and they serve low income or disadvantaged individuals. And our clients are otherwise unable to afford legal services. If you're interested in learning more about becoming a client or to apply, you can go to our website. And also on our website, we have a ton of resources available to anybody. These resources include articles, webcasts, podcasts, and we do occasionally have in-person events too. So if you go to our website, you'll be able to find out when and where those are. And now a quick disclaimer before Doug speaks to us about lobbying and advocacy. Please keep in mind that today's presentation is just general information. Doug will be able to answer some questions today too, but they will need to be kept pretty general. If you have any specific questions related to your organization and what it's doing, please reach out to an attorney for more specific legal guidance. And now a little bit about Doug, because Doug is he's a bit of a rock star when it comes to political law. He practices in the area of federal and state political law and litigation. He's been recognized by multiple publications for his work in the area of political law. He advises an array of clients, including political committees, candidates, government agencies, and nonprofit organizations. He has defended clients in high-profile cases and has spoken on various aspects of political law at seminars around the country. He's testified before legislative committees, and he's been quoted in multiple media sources, both local and national. And he's still here today to speak to us about advocacy and lobbying for Georgia nonprofits. Doug, we're so thrilled to have you here to speak with us today.
Well, thank you, Sarisha. I really appreciate it. That was a heck of an introduction, and I really appreciate you doing that. Last time we did this one, I think, was 2012. So I want to thank you for updating the presentation. Luckily, not too much of the law has changed back in the past 11 years, but I was honored to do it then, and I'm happy to do it again today. Good afternoon, everybody. Looking forward to getting through the presentation. Couple things. One of the dangers of having a home office is that sometimes your neighbors decide to make noise at inappropriate times. My neighbor has decided to pressure wash his driveway today. So I think we've got that problem solved, but if there's any background noise, I apologize in advance for that. One of the disadvantages of having a home office. Our law firm is based in Johns Creek, and we have about 18 lawyers in 6 states in the District of Columbia. And as Sarisha said, we do political law, which includes advising nonprofits on the laws governing political activities. Today, we're going to talk about a subset of that. We're not going to really talk about campaign activities in the sense of election year, influencing elections, campaign contributions, and the like. We're going to talk mostly about lobbying activities, but I want everybody to sort of understand at the outset the different types of nonprofit organizations that exist and the different types of activities that the IRS and the DOJ and state regulatory authorities look at when they're governing political activities by these entities. The most important thing to keep in mind about this is it's not something to be afraid of. A lot of nonprofit organizations, particularly 501c3s, are aware of the prohibition on making campaign contributions, and that tends to have them shy away from engaging in any political activity, including lobbying, trying to influence legislation, issue advocacy, voter education, and the like. The law has been designed to allow nonprofits to engage in certain types of activities with respect to lobbying. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And the important thing is not to be afraid of it. There are actually some very good rules that, if you follow carefully, allow you to play a role in this process. We also have a chat button up. Sarisha is going to monitor that. If anybody has any questions along the way, I'd like to keep this informal. Please feel free to ask me any questions along the way, and we'll be happy to try and answer those. If you have one of those questions where you're asking for a friend who's got a problem, where you heard about somebody who made a big mistake, probably best not to bring that up during this call. Why don't you have your friend give me a phone call later and we can talk about that separately. So today we're going to talk again on the agenda. There are three categories of political activities: political campaign activity, which we're really not going to focus on; lobbying, which we'll focus on more heavily here; and advocacy. Sarisha, if you don't mind, go ahead and go forward. All right. So as I'm sure almost all of you know, there are three different types of exempt organizations, and there's actually four, but we didn't include the C6s in here. Which are governed by the laws on political activities for nonprofits. First off, there's 501c3s, which I assume everybody on this call is: charities, schools, churches, foundations, etc. 501c4, which is a social welfare organization. It's an organization that has as its primary purpose influencing public policy and engaging in social welfare. Those organizations have been used a lot lately in political campaign activity, election activity as well. But their primary purpose has to be social welfare. Then there are C6s, which we didn't include in here, but that's trade associations, chambers of commerce, and the like. And the rules for C4s and C6s are basically the same. And then Section 527 of the Internal Revenue Code governs political committees. And these sections here, 501, 501c3 and 4, and 527, are sections of Title 26 of the United States Code, which governs tax law. Many organizations that we deal with have multiple subsets or multiple affiliated groups that have a C3 for one purpose, education, charitable work, a C4 for social welfare, and then a separate political committee. Today, we're going to be focusing on C3s. Sarisha, please go ahead. Thanks. Thank you. This is just, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this gives you all, for your own reference, a little bit more detailed description of what those three different types of organizations are and what they do. Okay, you can go forward, please. All right. So as we talked about very briefly at the beginning, there are three types of activities that the IRS scrutinizes and that state regulatory agencies scrutinize: political campaign activity, lobbying, and then general and issue advocacy. The rules vary depending on the type of the entity. And today, again, we're going to be talking just about C3s and what the rules are there. Sorry to repeat that, but we wanted to be able to have this later when you're looking back on it and sort of have some structure to this. So please go ahead, Sarisha. All right, so for C3s, as you probably all know, political campaign activity is strictly prohibited. You cannot make campaign contributions to elected officials or to candidates or to political committees. Doing that can cost a C3 its tax-exempt status. And where you see this issue pop up a lot, for example, is with churches that decide to get involved in political activity, having speakers come. There are a whole subset of rules that the IRS has drafted. They tend to be vague, but that the rules essentially define, what is and is not political activity. Before you engage in anything related to an election, make sure you consult with a lawyer and take a look at the revenue rulings that they cite. There's one in particular from 2007, which lists a whole series of potential activities that C3s might be involved in, and whether they cross the line into political activities, which are things that tend to be partisan, or whether they are legitimate, neutral, nonpartisan activities and they don't involve a campaign contribution. We're not going to be talking about that in detail today because the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta has done another webcast. Sarisha has included the link here. If you're interested in that, please go take a look. So what is the basic rule for a C3 organization on lobbying? Can it engage in lobbying at all? For public charities, the answer is yes, you can. The rule is that the lobbying efforts may not become a substantial part of your activities. If it becomes a substantial part of your activities, it becomes taxable, and it could in fact threaten your tax status as a C3. General advocacy, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which is not lobbying, is permitted. You can do that in unlimited amounts. Next slide, please. All right, so what are lobbying activities and what do they typically involve? Well, for example, directly contacting members of a legislative body. If you contact a member of Congress or you contact a member of the Georgia General Assembly trying to get specific legislation passed or defeated, that is lobbying. Encouraging the public to contact members of a legislative body also constitutes lobbying. It's not direct lobbying because you're not directly contacting the legislators, but it's grassroots lobbying. Grassroots lobbying is a shorthand term, which basically means that if you try to influence the public to contact the legislators for you and you're not doing it yourself, that's grassroots lobbying, and under state and federal rules, that is covered and have to be taken into account. And in addition, advocating a position on a public referendum is also lobbying. If there's a ballot initiative, if there is a constitutional amendment on the ballot, then that in fact can constitute lobbying as well. Let's see. The question that was posted is any contact lobbying or just contact about a specific piece of legislation. It is about a specific piece of legislation. There has to be specific legislation involved for it to constitute lobbying. And there are a variety of rules there, but that is the general rule. It must involve specific legislation. So here, actually, this is the slide right here, which was where we headed right next. The second bullet point, it is specific legislation. It does not include general advocacy on public policy issues. It also generally does not include actions by the executive, like the governor's office or the White House or executive agencies, the judiciary or administrative bodies. There are exceptions, though. And so whenever you're engaging in contact with the specific organization, always a good idea to check on that ahead of time. You can go forward, Sarisha. So what are the two types of lobbying? Well, we've already talked about it very briefly, and it's important to keep in mind because in a second, we're going to be talking about what's called a 501H election, which is a very handy tool that allows you to engage in a certain specified amount of lobbying without having any tax consequences. But it does differentiate in the 501H rules between direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying. Direct lobbying is what you would think. It's an attempt to communicate directly with a public official to try and influence the passage of legislation. Grassroots means you're out in the public. You're broadcasting an advertisement or sending out a mailing or doing a radio ad or on the internet, trying to convince the public to go contact Joe Smith and encourage him to vote yes on Senate Bill 312. That's grassroots lobbying, and it does count towards your lobbying limit, which we'll talk about in just a second. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so what are the common exclusions to lobbying? And these are all spelled out in the code, the United States Code, the tax code. If you're wondering sort of where the authority is for these things and why they're listed here, they're all spelled out pretty clearly. Where the rubber meets the road is what exactly does nonpartisan analysis mean, for example, and it's oftentimes in the eye of the beholder. One of the things we always talk to our clients about when we get started working with them, and it's an important guide for you all as well, is you need to decide early on what is your risk tolerance, what's a win. We have clients who want to be in the position where they never want to be on the front page of the newspaper. They never want to have their conduct challenged. They never want an IRS audit. They want to stay far away from the line. And so a win for them means giving them very conservative advice. There are other clients that basically take the position, I don't care if I get a complaint or an audit, as long as I've got a good faith argument on which to win. we tend to give more liberal advice in that circumstance. But as you can see, some of these terms that are used by the IRS to describe what is permissible and impermissible are very fuzzy. What is nonpartisan analysis, study, or research? Well, it's sort of like pornography. You know it when you see it. If it's partisan, it will be trying to encourage a particular person to vote for a particular party. And if it's nonpartisan and straight down the line, it looks much more non-biased. If it is nonpartisan and you do nonpartisan analysis, or you put together a study or research, you can distribute that in any fashion you want. You may even take a view on specific legislation as long as you're taking a nonpartisan and objective viewpoint. Before you do that, it's always a good idea, though, to talk to counsel, because you want to make sure you're acting on advice of counsel and getting an independent determination of whether you think it's all right. The second thing that's not lobbying, the big exclusion, is technical advice to a government unit or a committee in response to a request in writing. If you are asked to go testify before a legislative committee on certain legislation, or asked for your expertise, or asked for an opinion by an administrative agency or government agency about legislation, and you offer that in response to that request, that's not lobbying, and there's an exception for that. Self-defense activities tends to be the things where you need a lawyer to represent you, where somebody is coming after you for a violation of some sort of provision of law, and the question of whether your tax status is valid, whether you filed the proper filings, whether or not your tax-exempt status is the proper given your activities, those kinds of things. When you're defending yourself against the IRS or a government agency, that is not lobbying. Same sort of thing as if a lawyer files a pleading in a court of law. That's not lobbying when you're trying to influence the court and the jury to rule in your favor. Next slide, please, Sarisha. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how the IRS determines whether or not you've engaged in too much lobbying. And remember, the standard under the law is a 501c3 can keep its tax status as long as it does not have a substantial part of its activities involving lobbying. So what does substantial part mean? Well, there is a fuzzy test for it, and then there's a very specific legislative test for it, which is in the law, which is very helpful. We'll talk about each of those in turn. So next slide, please. All right, so the no substantial part test, the code provision is that first clause right there. Basically, again, no substantial part of a C3's activities may involve lobbying. So how does the IRS determine that? Well, it's a very fuzzy test. It's very subjective. It's a facts and circumstances analysis, meaning the IRS will look, if they turn their attention to you, at all the facts and circumstances of your particular case, and you will tend to be at the mercy of whatever analyst makes the determination within the IRS, because it's very hard to get it overturned once somebody starts going down a particular path. There is no specific set measurement, no percentage. They look at all your activities, and it's interesting because they look not only at your expenditures and how much you've spent, but also on your other activities. How much time do your employees and even your volunteers spend on lobbying as a percentage of the group's overall activities? The IRS has not given specific guidance on what is and is not substantial as a percentage, but there have been a number of cases over the years where a 5 to 10% of your activities, if that's spent on lobbying, you're likely to pass the substantial part test, this subjective test. You're likely to get by if it's 5 or 10%. You start getting yourself into the 15% range, you've got more of a problem. Next slide, please. All right, so what happens if you violate the substantial part test using the subjective test? And again, not the 501H test, which we'll talk about in a minute. First off, you can jeopardize your tax-exempt status as a C3, which would mean all of your income becomes subject to taxation. You would lose your eligibility to receive charitable deductions, and there is an excise tax on the lobbying expenditures that you would have to pay. Importantly, and this is an important issue for individuals who run 501c3s that are engaging in lobbying activities, there is also the possibility of penalties on the officers or the managers of the entity itself if they knowingly violated the rule and knowingly exceeded the percentages. That does not exist under the 501H rules, which we'll talk about in a second. So keep in mind that if you decide to engage in lobbying and you decide that you want to follow the no substantial part subjective test and rules, there is a risk that the IRS has a fuzzy way of determining what is and is not acceptable, and the officers of the entity itself may also be subjected to penalties, which tends to suggest that going the 501H route, which we'll talk about in a minute, is a much better option. Next slide, please. All right. So let's talk about 501H. 501H is, again, a provision in the tax code adopted a number of years ago, and it was designed to solve this problem of the subjectivity and the confusion about what substantial part meant. It is a provision which has some specific tests and standards, all focused on expenditures. Now, it's not focused on activities. It's all focused on money that allows you to make sure that you're complying with the rules, that you're not jeopardizing your tax-exempt status, and that you're also not paying taxes that you don't need to do. It's important to note that this option is not available to churches, and it's not available to private foundations. Private foundations and churches need to be extremely cautious. There are excise taxes that apply if they engage in lobbying activities. So we're really talking here about public charities as having the option on the 501H. The way you choose 501H is by filing this form 5768. It's an IRS form. It's 1 page long. It's very straightforward. You just have to file it at any time in your tax year. And once it's on file, it remains in effect for subsequent tax years. You can also revoke it at any time you want, but it's very easy to do if you choose to do that. Next slide, please. Okay. So the basic point of this is that you can engage as a C3 charity in lobbying activities without jeopardizing your tax-exempt status, so long as your expenditures do not exceed a certain amount. And that's based on the size of the organization, meaning your budget and how much you spend. Okay, Suresh, next one. All right, so there's a two-part test in the statute, and it focuses on two different numbers. And we're kind of getting into the weeds here, and so I won't go into this in much detail. If you have questions, it's a very good idea to talk to your own CPA before you engage in these kinds of activities. But this gives you a general overview of how the law works. They look at first, number one, the total direct and grassroots lobbying expenditures. Remember, we talked about the distinction between direct lobbying, directly contacting legislators, and grassroots, contacting the public to ask them contact legislators. And they come up with a combined limit for that amount of what you may do, what is legal. And the second thing is they also look at your grassroots lobbying expenditure limit. You have to pay attention to both of those limits, the 100%, which is both combined, and the 25%, as you see in the last little bullet point there. The grassroots portion cannot exceed 25% of your overall lobbying expenditures. If you exceed those limits, then you may end up having to pay excise taxes to the government. And there are other consequences, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so here are the total limits. And basically, if on the left-hand side, you talk about your exempt purpose expenditures, how much the budget is for the C3 and how much you are spending. And on the right, it shows what the percentage is that you may spend on lobbying expenditures without causing yourself problems. So basically, if your budget is $500,000 or under, if you spend $100,000, which is 20% of your exempt purpose expenditures on lobbying, you're fine. As you notice, as it goes down the scale, it becomes what's the opposite of progressive? I'm not very good with that, sorry, but it decreases the percentage that you can use as the higher brackets go up. So the total amount, the maximum that you can end up spending on lobbying expenditures without tax consequences is $1 million. And that basically means you would have to have a budget of about $17 million to hit that $1 million threshold under these numbers. As long as you stay within those numbers, you're fine and won't have tax consequences. Next slide, please. This is just repeating what we said previously, up to 20% of the first 500,000, which is 100, and then it decreases in percentage, overall cap of 1 million and 25% on grassroots lobbying. Thanks, Rishi. You can go ahead. So when you're calculating those numbers, what's included in the lobbying expenditures? And then basically the IRS looks at this broadly. anything that you are spending that relates to your efforts, including preparation, counts towards the lobbying expenditures. You wouldn't just count the cost of going out and having a luncheon meeting or traveling to an event. Anytime you spent preparing that, research planning, drafting, etc., all is included within that budget. And in addition, if you have office expenses and administrative expenses, staff expenses, you need to take into account a certain percentage of your overall expenses towards lobbying and add that into the budget amount. It's best not to make those calculations yourself. It's really helpful to have a third-party professional like a CPA actually doing the numbers for you, in part because they tend to be more objective and include things that you might otherwise want to exclude and therefore save you getting into trouble. But in addition, if the IRS ever looks at it, if you're able to say you relied on outside counsel, outside CPA to help you with the numbers, it gives you much more credibility. It's also a very good idea when you're doing it to paper it up at the time. One of the things we always talk about in the law is sort of a 3-piece of paper rule. When you've got an event somebody's going to, and you want to make sure you're complying with certain rules, you have an invitation that says what the event will be, you have the actual materials at the event, and then a follow-up. For these sorts of things, calculating your lobbying expenditures, it's a very good idea to have an email in the file or a letter to the file to your CPA, letter in the file to your CPA saying, will you please help us confirm these numbers? And that will come in handy later. Okay, next slide, please. So what are the penalties? And I apologize, I should have put the bullet points number 2 and 3 under bullet point 1, because those both apply to if you exceed the thresholds over a 4-year period. If you spend more than 150% of your permissible limit, in other words, you exceed it by 50%, and you do that over a 4-year period, you can lose your tax-exempt status as a C3, which means that all of your income is subject to tax. In a given particular year, if you exceed the 100% threshold that you're allowed, you will pay an excise tax, and it equals 25% of the amount that you spent. So it's an expensive tax. Next slide, please. All right. So now we're going to move on past the 501H, talk about some things that you may do that are permissible. And we won't go into this in a lot of detail, but I want to just give you some ideas of other things you can consider doing. One of them is distributing voting records, which are called legislative scorecards. It is not prohibited to distribute voting records on legislative issues, as long as the publication that you put out doesn't have an editorial opinion in it. And as long as the content of what you sent out is not does not contain any approval or disapproval of implied or directly of their voting records. That is something a number of C3s decide that they want to get involved in, and you may do that. Next slide, please. Other things that you are allowed to do, you may send questionnaires to candidates to ask for information. You may include their public responses in a voter guide. And you may select issues that are of importance to the electorate. So that gives you a lot of flexibility in how you want to engage in those activities. But again, I would be very careful. The language and the way you do that tends to matter. And you got to be careful avoiding sliding over into partisan activities. But those are some things that some C3s are doing and are allowed to do. Next slide, please. These are when you start to walk over into prohibited political activities with your legislative scorecards or activities. If the questionnaire that you ask contains bias, and again, this is something that's going to be subjective in the eyes of the beholder, so you want to stay far away from the line as you can, but if it does exhibit bias towards a candidate, then you may walk yourself into problems. The voter guide focuses just on issues that are important to the organization. That's a little fuzzy, and again, same sort of thing. Where is the line? Title entirely unclear. And if the guide emphasizes one particular issue area, indicating it, that indicates that its purpose is nonpartisan voter education. Next slide, please. Sorry. All right, so that is all we are going to talk about with respect to the IRS and lobbying. Most of those rules that we just discussed are tax rules. They are federal tax rules, and they govern what you may or may not do. And that involves lobbying, obviously, federally or state level. The IRS will determine whether or not your tax status has been implicated, but you may do it if you so choose. Let's talk a little bit about Georgia lobbying expenditures in case you want to lobby down at the legislature. Now, these are not tax rules. It's not going to it's not going to impact your tax status in any way other than what we already discussed, but it may involve requiring you or some of your individuals to register as lobbyists in Georgia. And if you engage in certain activities, there are prohibitions on what you may or may not do. So about 10 years ago, the Georgia General Assembly adopted totally new rules on lobbying, and it was a fundamental change. It was no longer disclosure alone. They actually included some prohibitions. And one of the things that states do on lobbying rules is they vary. Some states are very permissive on what you can do as long as you report it. Other states tend to be restrictive, and you may or may not do certain things even if you do report it. Georgia had been for a long, long time a very permissive state where it only required reporting, but you had allowed to engage in lobbying activities. In the law that was passed some time ago, about 10 years ago now, they changed all that. And so it is extremely complicated. It is messy. I don't expect you to understand it after we go through this presentation, but I want you to understand that the rules exist and that you need to talk to somebody before you engage in lobbying down at the General Assembly because it gets complicated. So the current rule is that a registered lobbyist, and a registered lobbyist is always just an individual. An organization does not register to lobby, only individuals do. A registered lobbyist may not make an expenditure, which makes, of course, absolutely no sense. And a public officer also now may not accept an expenditure from a lobbyist. So that basically means for the first time when the law was adopted, public officials themselves can get in trouble for accepting certain types of expenditures and payments from registered lobbyists. What that means is that the registered lobbyists now have an entirely different scheme that they have to be careful about, because if they make a mistake, they're not only getting themselves in trouble, they're getting a public official in trouble. And that can be disastrous, obviously, for your government relations efforts. The law says, though, while you may not make an expenditure as a registered lobbyist, you may make a lobbying expenditure. So it's extremely complex. They drafted this rule where an expenditure is very broad and what you may not do, and then they carve out from that things you may do, and they call them lobbying expenditures. So next slide, please, Sarisha. All right, so structurally, again, think of it this way. Any sort of expenditure that is made for the purpose of influencing a public officer is going to be an expenditure. That's true if it can reasonably be construed as designed to influence a public officer. It also includes payment of more than $75 per person from any individual lobbyist for any of those items. Next slide, please. It also includes, and this was a big one, this is a big no-no, and you got to be very careful if you do this, tickets for sporting, recreational events, concerts, and that sort of thing. That became a real hot button issue in Georgia. So registered lobbyists may not provide tickets to sporting events, Falcons games, tickets and to concerts and those sorts of things. That's highly likely to get you on the front page of the AJC. You also cannot do reimbursement for recreational or leisure activities. Take somebody to, a park or something like that, fun like that, to amusement park. You can't do that. But an expenditure does not include a lobbying expenditure. So having talked about expenditures which are illegal, now the legislature then carved out things that are legal, which are these lobbying expenditures. Let's go into that. And again, I won't get too much in the weeds, but we will talk about a few of them. Next slide, please.
Doug, I have a quick question about the tickets that you mentioned on the last slide.
Sure.
Would this include tickets to an organization's gala or like any other special events? Could they give those for free?
It could qualify, and I'll explain when we get through in a little bit. There are some exceptions. For example, and why don't we do this? When we get a couple more slides ahead, we'll talk about specific examples. There are ways you might be able to do that. For example, if you extend the invitation to all members of an agency, like all members of a committee, or if you extend the invitation to a public official and the event directly relates to their official duties and it's in the United States, that also qualifies. So there are ways to get that done. One of the other things we should keep in mind about this is that The law was drafted so these prohibitions only apply to people who are registered lobbyists, the individuals. Technically, the prohibitions don't apply to the organizations that hire the lobbyists. So let's say there's a corporation, Coca-Cola, I'm not just going to throw out an organization, and they have a bunch of registered lobbyists. Theoretically, the registered lobbyist could not give an elected official a ticket to a Braves game. Could Coca-Cola, which is the employer of the lobbyist? Nobody really knows. The law doesn't expressly state that you could not, but we're still sort of waiting for that test case where an employer of a lobbyist tries it and a complaint gets filed. My guess is that no matter how hard we would argue as lawyers, that the law must be strictly construed in favor of the defendants, which is true, that the State Ethics Commission, which looks at this, would find that it was an impermissible expenditure. So we've advised our clients not to do it. And so far, there has not been a test case on that. Okay. Sorry, a little bit of a segue, but important to keep in mind that the rule from the outset only applies to the registered lobbyists and not to the organization. So other things that are permissible, and these are lobbying expenditures which are allowed, promotional items distributed to the general public or public officers. If you come and show up at the General Assembly and you give a member of the General Assembly something from Pro Bono Partnership, a plaque or something like that, you give to everybody, that's perfectly fine. Food and beverages produced in Georgia. Now that's incredibly broad and discriminatory. If you bring somebody apples that you have grown in Georgia and come and give them a basket, that's perfectly permissible. One of the things that's always interesting to me is, well, if you take somebody out to dinner and the food and the beverages that they eat were all produced in Georgia, are you good where you don't have to worry about any of the other requirements? We haven't had that test case pop up yet. Discounts offered to the public. This is an important one. If you offer, and it's less so for C3s than it is for businesses, but if you offer products to the general public at a discount, and you may do that, as long as it's offered to everybody equally, you can offer the same to a public official without that being a lobbying expenditure. Compensation for private employment, you can hire somebody and pay them their salary. And campaign contributions, which is irrelevant for y'all, are not lobbying expenditures. They may be relevant for your officers, though, because obviously C3 officers and individuals can make campaign contributions, even if the organization can't. If you give a campaign contribution to somebody, that's not going to be something that's going to be a lobbying expenditure, nothing you have to worry about. Okay, next slide. So this is getting us to sort of one of the things that Sarisha was just talking about. There are permitted lobbying expenditures that include food, beverages, and registration at group events to which all members of an agency are invited. And so if it's a committee of the House or the Senate, or you invite the entire county commission to come to an event that your organization has put on, the cost that you pay for food, beverages, and any registration, which includes the ticket price, if you give that to them, it's not a lobbying expenditure, or it is a permitted lobbying expenditure if done by a lobbyist. It's not illegal. You may do that. Next one, please. This is also the one we talked about very briefly just a second ago. If it relates to the public officer's official duties and it's an event within the United States, you may pay for the travel for the public official and food and beverages for their staff. So one of the ways this is done very frequently is if there is an organization or a corporation in Georgia that has branches in another state, and they want to show the legislators how that other branch or factory works. If you fly them out there for it and it relates to their official duties, there's legislation that is relevant to that business, then you've got a good argument that that's permissible, even if it's paid for by the registered lobbyist. This one is used quite often by registered lobbyists because it's very broad. As you can see, the first bullet point talks about educational and informational meetings. Well, pretty much every meeting you ever have is going to be informational in one way or another. So that gives you a lot to work with. Next slide, please. Then anything which is under $75 per person is permissible. And this applies to, actually, I'm going to have to remove that slide. The Ethics Commission has gone back and forth on whether or not payments to a spouse can apply. Before you do anything involving spouse, please talk to a lawyer first. Okay, next slide, please. All right, let's talk, and we won't get into the weeds in this in too much detail, but I want to talk about something that everybody involved in lobbying needs to be aware of, which are rules on briberies, which are the rules on bribery and gifts. How do you engage in government relations activities that do not cross the line into bribery? Well, what is bribery? Bribery is basically when you ask an official to take official action as a quid pro quo for you offering them something to which they are not entitled. And so if you give somebody information or campaign contribution, for example, Georgia Supreme Court has held this can be a violation, and it's linked to official action, that is bribery. It oftentimes is fuzzy because obviously you want to have, if you're engaged in lobbying, you want to have good relations with public officials and you want to give campaign contributions, and people do this all the time. So where is the line between what is permissible and impermissible? And oftentimes it's in the eyes of the prosecutor. It is pretty rare that bribery prosecutions are pursued, and they are only usually pursued in extreme cases. But what you need to know is that you should never, when you're engaging in lobbying activities and trying to influence official action, offer anything to the elected official or public official in exchange for their vote or their support. Keep the two things entirely linked. It's why we tell people, if you're going to make campaign contributions to a public official, do it entirely separate from the meeting in which you talk about the legislation you want to get adopted. Next slide, please.
And Doug, before we move to advocacy, I have a question related to lobbying, but more like grassroots lobbying. One of our viewers is asking, can you explain the distinction with the call to action for grassroots lobbying? For example, if we say our organization thinks we should pass XYZ, but not, so please write your senators.
Yeah, there are certain rules where you're speaking to your membership, where it varies depending on exactly what you're doing, where it may or may not involve lobbying. Honestly, I haven't looked at those in a while, but I'll be happy to follow up and provide some additional information on that when we post the final video, if you like. Any other questions?
No, not right now.
Okay. All right, so we're now moving on from lobbying to general issue advocacy. The key point to keep in mind that we talked about at the beginning is there is a limit to how much lobbying you may do. It may not be a substantial part of your activities. There is no limit to how much general issue advocacy that you may engage in. So, for example, if you're attempting to influence the public policy on issues, but it doesn't involve specific legislation, that's perfectly fine. Attempting to influence other branches of the government is perfectly fine. If you're engaging in nonpartisan voter registration, get out the vote drives, etc., that is permissible and does not constitute lobbying as long as it's done in a nonpartisan manner. Next slide, please. All right, just a few general notes. At the beginning, we talked a little bit about campaign activities and election-related activities. If you are interested in that, IRS Revenue Ruling 2007-41, which I mentioned briefly, is an important place to start, and I wanted you to have that in your materials. Keep in mind that the contributions that 501c3s may not make include in-kind contributions. It doesn't have to be just giving somebody cash. If you give them something of value, it could be an in-kind contribution. If you offer a public official a discounted computer along those lines, it could be an in-kind contribution. Keep that in mind. Make sure you never offer a reward to anyone for voting. This is something that corporations have gotten in trouble with a few times because, for example, there was one organization that offered a free soda to anybody who came into their restaurant wearing an "I voted" sticker. That's illegal. You're not allowed to offer any incentive to anybody for voting. And again, on voter education and registration, be careful, make sure it's nonpartisan. Next slide, please. All right, that's all I have. If anybody has any questions, my contact information is right there, and I'll be happy to help.
We do have some questions popping up in the chat. Doug, do you want to read those off?
Sure, let's see.
I can do it.
Organization voice publicly on national or state issues without repercussion from the IRS. Again, if you're talking about public policy issues, the general answer is yes. If you're engaging in influencing legislation or a specific piece of legislation, then the lobbying rules apply, and you have to make sure that that's not a substantial part of your activities. But if you're just engaging in advocacy and public policy, expressing viewpoints on public policy generally, that should be fine. Anybody else?
Well, it doesn't look, I don't see any other questions. For now, I'll give the audience a minute if they would like to type anything else up. But in the meantime, I do want to say thank you to the nonprofits who have tuned in. And thank you to you, Doug, for speaking.
My pleasure.
For any of the nonprofits who are joining us today, if you're interested in learning more about PBPA, you can sign up for our newsletter or follow us on social media. And Doug has graciously provided his contact information here as well. So if there's any follow-up questions, if you are a client of PBPA, we encourage you to reach out to us as well. A question about the presentation. Yes, it will be made available on our website next week, and the recording and the slides will be available there. And well, I think that's it. That's it for this installment of PBPA's webcast series. Our next presentation will be in June, I believe it's June 14th, and we will be talking about best practices for a legally compliant website. But thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate everybody. Thanks, Sarisha.
Thank you, Doug.